Well, you know, Syria will be topping the agenda as National Security Advisor John Bolton travels this next week to Israel. He'll meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other top security officials. They are expected to delve into the president's decision to pull those troops out of Syria. Mr. Bolton tweeting this yesterday, quote, "Looking forward to visiting Israel and Turkey in January. We will discuss our continued work confronting security challenges facing allies and partners in the region, including the next phase of the fight against ISIS as the U.S. begins to bring troops home from Syria." What does this mean? Let's bring in retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis of the U.S. Army, senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities. Colonel, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Always great to be here. Thanks.
You know, the president said he couldn't get an end date from the military and the Pentagon on Syria. He would always ask for 6 more months. And he said, no more. And he made his decision. Critics saying it handed the broken country back to Assad and Putin and the Iranians. So how does Bolton reassure the Israelis?
Well, number one, it's very important to understand, and your previous segment there just kind of underscored all the chaos and all the multiple organizations and entities that are operating up in that area. But the fact of the matter is, this is still a civil war, and it's also really important to understand that Syria owns. I mean, that is their sovereign country, and they have allies of Russia and Iran. They've had them before all this happened. They have them now, and they're going to have it afterwards. So we're not ceding anything because we don't actually own any terrain. We just occupy certain spots on the ground. So one of the big misapprehensions is that these troops of ours are providing some sort of really important strategic operation right now, and they're not. So pulling them out will not cause us any harm because that's not actually how we defend ourselves from terrorist operations around the world. So it's the right thing to do.
But what about those critics who say, our presence there helps bolster the fight against the Iranians specifically, helps buttress Russia? Let me read you something from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. They're pretty stinging on the president's move. They say, quote, "Those troops and civilians were the hinge of long-term Iranian containment, a low-cost use of American soldiers backed up by allied European special operations units that had checked the advance of a much larger and costly Iranian, Russian, and Syrian regime forces. Trump's withdrawal has severely weakened his own Iran policy, signaling boredom, fickleness, fatigue, and fear. He's weakened American allies in the region and probably obliged the Kurds who fought with us in Syria to seek protection from Russia, from Iran and Russia." So, Colonel, what do you say to those who think this was absolutely the wrong decision, sending the wrong message, and only bolsters Putin and the Iranians?
I could not disagree more strongly with that, because if you follow that logic, we will never leave the area. We will have to be there forever. The fact is, this is Syria's country. This is not our country that should just go in and stay as we wish. And the other thing that's really important to point out, we don't need a handful of troops on the ground to contain Iran. Our conventional and nuclear deterrent against Iran is so overwhelmingly stronger than anything they could ever muster. We don't need that. But we do endure enormous risk by having those troops there, because they may get involved with the civil war. They may accidentally clash with Russian troops, and that could escalate into who knows what, all of which would be bad. But I do got to point out there's one critically important thing that's not being mentioned there, and that's the fact that if our troops are going to perform a mission like that, that has to be debated and discussed and authorized by Congress. The president doesn't have the authority to just decide that that's what he wants to do. Those troops were sent there to get ISIS out of Raqqa with the Syrian Democratic Forces. That mission was accomplished. You can't just now change the mission and decide that they're going to contain Russia, whatever that even means. And so we have to follow our Constitution if we're going to, use our military forces.
Do you think the president is right when he says that they can use the Iraqi bases that we have to try and move into Syria if need be against ISIS?
Well, as you've seen, there's a lot of backlash in Baghdad about that, because a lot of their members of Congress in multiple parties, even those that are against each other within there, are all saying, hey, it's time for the United States to leave. This isn't their country. And the same thing applies here. If we're going to use, if we even think we're going to use some base for our military purpose, that has to be authorized by Congress. And just because we went in there, in 2003 under obviously false accusations about the WMD, if we're going to do something like that, Congress has to weigh in on it. I just can't reiterate that enough. We can't have the president anymore just unilaterally, any president, just saying here's what the military is going to do.
I guess the real tragedy of all this is that someone like Assad, a butcher who has just massacred his own people in such an unbelievably catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe that we saw back in the 1940s and the 30s. Not to that extent, but in many ways very similar. Chemical attacks on their own people. He's being rewarded, in effect. Was there anything that the international community, the UN, that we could have done, the civilized world could have done to stop that?
You know, I honestly, I don't think that there is, because unless you're willing to go to war and to kill even more people and to lose your own, we can't stop every regime around the world from doing the things we want to, or certainly we wish, because, man, my heart goes out to everybody who suffered. I've actually been to the region several times and have visited with the people who were refugees who were driven out of the country as that, and it just breaks your heart. But the fact is, our military can't solve all these problems because they're mainly political and diplomatic in nature, and it has to be solved by the people on the ground, however much it hurts our hearts.
Colonel Daniel Davis, we thank you for being with us this weekend, and of course, thank you, sir, for your service to our nation.
Always my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Of course.